Hobbits. Oh, well, you meet them, you know. There's hobbits by nature and hobbits by stature, and there's hobbits who happen to be both, yeah. I was, on the whole, a rather puny, over-mothered, timid little creature who was not much of a success. I eventually became a fairly ordinary scholar. Turned out to be good at rugby football, of all odd things. I've always smoked. I sometimes smoke beyond the point when you enjoy it, which is silly, but I do smoke and enjoy it. And as a matter of fact, it's now so tied to writing that I can't write without it.
John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, CBE, is the famous British philologist, university professor, and author. As a result of the unprecedented success of his Middle-earth books, Tolkien is often hailed as the father of high fantasy. His works almost single-handedly propelled fantasy writing into the mainstream of adult literature. As a result of Tolkien's influence, the fantasy genre exploded into life with imitators, innovators, and legions of avid readers.
Not only have you had a marvellous adventure story and a marvellous fantasy, but some of the magic has rubbed off on the ordinary, very homely things of life, like a good meal.
Like food, there's a great joy in food.
Food? Never been a trencherman. I admire trenchermen, therefore I make... But I like, I must say, since England produces the best basic food in Europe, on the whole, it does.
And drink, the fact that there are pubs in Middle-earth.
Yes, I drink things with day. I like, of course, feeling elevated and...
All these are sort of homely, pleasant things, and it's the sort of basis of things homely in the Shire.
John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born in Bloemfontein, South Africa. However, his parents were both from England. Sadly, Tolkien's father died when Ronald was just 3. A second tragic event occurred when his mother also died, when Tolkien was just a schoolboy aged 12. J.R.R. Tolkien rose above adversity. He had a lifelong passion and talent for the study of languages. In consequence, he was soon identified as a gifted scholar. Under the benign influence of his guardian, Father Francis Xavier Morgan, he worked hard as a student and won a place at Oxford University to study the classics, the study of ancient Greek and Latin literature, philosophy, and history. Tolkien later switched to study English literature, and he graduated with first-class honours. In the early days, Tolkien was living in Sair Hall. Nowadays, it's part of the outskirts of Birmingham, so you have to come slightly further out to discover this kind of landscape. But you can see all around where the inspiration for a place like the Shire might have come from.
Then the mother decided that she must move the children into Birmingham in reach of good schools, and he hated this move in this big smoky city. I mean, it really was when industrial pollution was at its height, you know, the factory chimneys belching out. That he hated, though in a way I feel he loved it, because I think you can see this reflected in his descriptions of Mordor, the country which is the seat of evil incarnate in The Lord of the Rings, where you have this wonderful description of the smoking, fiery mountain, Mount Doom, which is the centre of it, and an impression of a vast factory-like caves and so on, where orcs, goblins, you know, work at build their armaments and so on. This is quite clearly reflects something of Birmingham in the early 1900s.
One of the things that Tolkien detested above all else is modernity. He hated to see the end of what he considered to be the old English way of life, and that the connection with nature was quickly being swept aside by the forces that had begun at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and obviously in the 20th century had begun to really build pace. Tolkien enlisted in the British Army in 1915, the second year of the Great War. Before he was shipped over to see action in France on the 22nd of March 1916, Tolkien married Edith Mary Bratt. They eventually had 4 children, 3 sons, John, Michael, Christopher, and a girl named Priscilla. In the Great War, Tolkien fought in the trenches on the Somme front. But in September 1916, he was invalided home with trench fever. Although the name sounds innocuous, the reality was horrendous. Trench fever was a virulent disease borne by body lice, and this awful disease is closely related to the epidemic of typhus. Tolkien eventually recovered and underwent a long period of hospitalized convalescence.
Kind of experience so awful on the Somme battlefield that he shut it out from the rest of his mind. It comes in at moments in the story, in The Lord of the Rings, where the heroes are undergoing various awful experiences. But really what it did was drive him more and more into himself and make him more determined to cultivate his own private landscape. And so he withdrew really from the war, and it was at that point he began to write his books.
After the war, Tolkien found employment helping to produce the Oxford English Dictionary.
I think that was a kind of double coming home, which made the effect on the ordinary English meadows, countryside, and breaks so immensely important to me.
Under eastern sea, a sky where the bright moon warmed, in a land of bright bird song.
He then returned to academia, becoming a professor of English language at the University of Leeds, and he died on the 2nd of September 1973. Tolkien is, of course, best known for his most famous two literary works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit has become one of the most successful children's books of all time, if not the most successful children's book. Millions and millions of copies have been printed, and it's gone into dozens of languages all around the world. And it's very satisfying and heartwarming to know that the genesis for this book actually stemmed from Tolkien's relationship with his own children. Every Christmas, he used to write his children a letter, which he managed to convince them came from Father Christmas at the North Pole. And it was this tradition of writing for his own children that led directly to the creation of The Hobbit.
He began to write for his children, really, when the first of them, the eldest of them, John, was a small boy. What he did was to make up a letter from Father Christmas each Christmas and leave it in the fireplace. And these letters are full of Father Christmas telling the children what's happened at the North Pole the last Christmas and so on. They stretch from 1921 till the mid-1940s. And they get better and better, and they're very entertaining and beautifully illustrated. And he's actually, in a sense, trying out his wings for writing for children in The Hobbit.
The Father Christmas letters began when I was about 3. They were very exciting because they always arrived, sometimes only on Christmas morning, but sometimes they came with the ordinary post. And when they came late, they inevitably left awful muddy, snowy footmarks all over the floor when Father Christmas had come down the chimney with the letter and left it. They were a very important part of Christmas for all of us.
It was a very gradual transformation from absolute total belief into a realization that it must be my father who did it all. But such a pleasure in keeping the process going that one believed and yet knew and what the truth was. And certainly my brothers never in any way spoiled it for me. They entered into this absolutely, although they knew so much longer than I did that my father was Father Christmas.
What do you think the poor dear old bear has been and done this time? Nothing as bad as letting off all the lights. Only fell from top to bottom of the main stairs on Thursday. We were beginning to get the first lot of parcels down out of the storerooms and into the hall. Polar Bear would insist on taking an enormous pile on his head, as well as lots in his arms. Bang, rumble, clatter, crash. Awful moanings and growlings.
He was very, very conscious of being a West Midland writer, almost unnaturally so. He was very proud of his mother's family, the Suffields, who came from Worcestershire. He was actually born in South Africa, in Bloemfontein, where quite by chance his father was working for a bank. But the family came from Birmingham, and when the father died young, the mother set up a home just outside Birmingham at Sarehole Mill. And this was glorious, idyllic countryside with a water mill, with sort of blackberry dells, copses and so on. And Tolkien and his brother roamed there for 3 or 4 years and had the such a wonderful time that it's quite clearly reflected in the opening chapters of The Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien describes the idyllic, happy rural life of the hobbits in the Shire.
In 1925, Tolkien moved to Oxford University, where he was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon History and a Fellow of Pembroke College until 1945. It was during his first years at Pembroke College that Tolkien had his first book published. He then moved within the same university to become the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow of Merton College. Tolkien held these positions from 1945 until his retirement in 1959.
He's the most unusual man I've ever come across who wrote books. I mean, authors are a notoriously unusual breed, but really he's not like any other figure in English literature. Very, very isolated in every sense. He was isolated socially. He moved in a small circle of Oxford dons, but not outside at all. He, I think, read very, very little in modern English writing. Not that much in English literature. In fact, since Chaucer, he used to say, English literature stopped at Chaucer. But there was something genuinely sad about him. One can't study his life without coming away feeling that there was a kind of deep unhappiness which motivated the books, which gives them their wonderful sort of longing for a past age. And the whole point of his stories is that they're about nostalgia, they're about looking back to a golden age that's gone. And by being stranded, as it were, in the 20th century, in modern industrial society and feeling completely out of place in it, he was able to create this writing.
Yes, well, he was a really absent-minded professor, and at the post office in High Street, the old lady there was rather a dragon, but he won her over by posting his false teeth through the screen and putting his envelope in his mouth. Similarly, the bank used to keep all the things he left there. I once went with him to the bank, and they opened the drawer and gave him back his last 2 or 3 pipes and gloves and things.
One of Tolkien's most engaging attributes was the fact that he also illustrated his own works in a unique and highly appealing style. He was a skilled illustrator who drew the magical pictures and maps for both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
Quite by accident, The Hobbit tumbled out of him because he had children and it originated as a story really for them. The story of the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, who goes off and challenges the dragon, the little tiny hero against the giant.
The actual beginning, though it's not really the beginning, but the actual flashpoint was, I remember very clearly. I can still see the corner in my house in 20 Northmoor Road where it happened. I got an enormous pile of exam papers there, and marking school examinations in the summertime is an enormous, very laborious, and unfortunately also boring. And I remember picking up a paper and actually finding. I nearly gave an extra mark for it, extra 5 marks, actually. There was one page on this particular paper was left blank. Glorious. Nothing to read. So I scribbled on it, I can't think why. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. I think that was eventually published in 1937.
As regards the writing style of The Hobbit, it's very straightforward. There are no great linguistic devices. For a first work, Tolkien did an excellent job of tailoring his language perfectly for the audience. He doesn't talk down to them or patronize them, so he was aware of just how the language of the book needed to be pitched, and he achieved it perfectly in The Hobbit.
Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed and at the end of his way and his wits. Suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel it'll make us Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The Hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, my precious?" whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself, through never having anyone else to speak to.
He used to tell stories every night, and often I went to sleep with hearing him telling fairy stories. I can't actually remember him telling the stories which were later incorporated into The Lord of the Rings. I think my older brothers do remember this, being that much older.
How it began, I would think, in 1926-27, when we first went to Oxford, and was told us at Christmas time, in chapters, which is why it has chapters of adventures. If we were lucky, we got a couple of extra chapters each Christmas, and the other ones had to be repeated, so it got longer and longer and longer.
As we know, Tolkien taught philology at Oxford, which is the study of how languages evolve over time.
It's very difficult to explain to anybody who hasn't, as I have, suffered the Oxford University English Language and Literature course exactly what philology is about. It's a science that was invented by a group of Germans during the 19th century. Largely, it's been said by certain people in order to befuddle the world outside, and it is a very, very dense subject to those who don't know. It's now out of fashion, is in fact now a dead subject. It's really being taken over entirely by linguistics and by different forms of language science. But basically all it is the historical study of languages. It's really quite simple. It means that you look at a language not as it stands at the moment, but you look at its history, you see how the forms of words have developed, and in doing so, you're liable to come across quite a lot of interesting history. Tolkien learnt that. In fact, he did partly teach himself. He began reading it while he was still at school, and this is fairly remarkable. He then went on to study it at Oxford.
But this is a children's book. There aren't a great deal of literary overtones. Nonetheless, we can see quite a number of influences, because Tolkien loved the surviving fragments of literature from the Dark Ages. He was also not just a teacher of, but a passionate devotee of the Icelandic Eddas and the Norse sagas. It was from these themes that Tolkien gained a lot of his inspiration for The Hobbit. We don't see a terribly large amount of it, but there's enough there in the society of the dwarves to see that clearly they have been modelled on the Norse society.
He was a very deep, profound Catholic, Roman Catholic, and this comes out in his books. Now, The Lord of the Rings is not a religious book in that it's not about God and the angels and so on, but in fact it's a very religious book in tone, and he knew this while writing it. It's really, it's a book which tries to convey the feeling of religion to a world which is not actually a believing world, a non-religious world. This, I think, is largely why it's been so popular in America, in what is on the whole a kind of godless modern world. It particularly appeals because it's bringing religion back into fiction.
I don't live in America. Surely they should tell me. I should like to ask them some questions of how such things arise. I observe in general that North America has always been much more easily kindled than England, or indeed any country in Europe. And for instance, the Dickens cult and the extraordinary excitement about Dickens. So the only people who came down to the quay to watch the mail ship coming, the only thing they wanted to know is what happened to the next chapter. They weren't worried about goods.
It's not just the physical world that Tolkien modelled on Warwickshire. These are rural people. And he looked around and he saw the kinds of rustic characters that were there at the turn of the century around these fields. And he built his Hobbit world very much based upon them. That the ordinary people of Warwickshire shrunk down in size so that we suddenly go out into this big, heroic world, we associate very much with the small people.
The Hobbits, I think, are Tolkien's image of people from the West Midlands at the start of this century, only shrunk. And the reason they're shrunk, I think, is that they're living in the world of the heroes. So they're like us. If we were living in a world of heroes, we wouldn't be able to run around throwing our weight about. We would have to manage as best we could. So the Hobbits have to manage as best they can by perseverance and determination and humor and their endemic inability to take things really seriously. So there is, as it were, a set of reader figures running through this heroic or epic landscape and just about surviving in it, just about managing. And that, I think, gives you something to identify with, set against a background which is entirely different and which offers a kind of glamour which has vanished from the world.
After the war, he became a university teacher, first really at Leeds and then back at Oxford. He wasn't, in some senses, a good teacher at all. His actual performance in the lecture room was largely incomprehensible to many people. My mother used to say that she was an undergraduate in the 30s at Oxford, say that if you sat in the front row you could hear him, but only in the front row, but then of course he spat all over you because his teeth didn't fit very well. And he went further back, it was quite inaudible.
Tolkien was one of these small group of writers from Oxford, each of whom created a very special and immortal fantasy land. First, of course, there was Lewis Carroll, who created Wonderland, where Alice had an adventure. This was followed by Tolkien himself, who created his Middle-earth. And finally, very hot on his heels, came C.S. Lewis with his Narnia adventures.
The main point about his Oxford career was that it gave him a lovely, cosy nest, really, to inhabit. His teaching duties weren't that heavy. He had a big house in North Oxford in which his 4 children grew up. He had marvellous friends in C.S. Lewis and other dons of like mind, all of them very strongly religious, all of them liking fairy stories and myths, and they would meet together in Oxford pubs for pints of beer and in Lewis's rooms in college on Thursday nights, and drink their beer and smoke their pipes and talk good manly talk and read their stories to each other. That was really wonderful. That's what was the best part of his life and really gave him the encouragement to go on writing.
I think there was no doubt about his ability, his intelligence, or the effect he'd had. There was also a strong feeling that he had rather given up the trade, that he didn't publish very much in the learned way after about 1940, 1941. He was still working on things, but not very fast. So I think there was, to begin with, a kind of puzzlement as to what he was doing with his time.
Tolkien created and worked on his fictional fantasy world that he named Middle-earth for most of his life. Middle-earth was, of course, the setting for his most famous books.
And he had a reputation for laziness. This was quite wrong. I think he was, an obsessive worker, but nobody saw the work being done. He was sitting at home writing his books and writing draft after draft after draft and trying to make it absolutely perfect. But he didn't tell everybody, or indeed many people at all, what he was doing.
John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II on the 28th of March, 1972. He died on the 2nd of September, 1973.
There were always mistakes all along the line. If you read his letters to his publishers, everything goes wrong. I mean, blocks are misplaced for illustrations, and this isn't right and that isn't right. It's a nice irony that at the very end, his third name, Rule, should be misspelt Revel on his tombstone.